For 8 years, no one really saw him. He was just the janitor. But when greed touched his refuge, it awakened something no one expected. Because there are battles not fought with weapons, but with memory and strategy. Before we begin, please, like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this. For 8 years, Ernest Guzman had cleaned the hallways of that commercial building in the historic downtown of Boston. He was invisible. An older man with slow speech, unhurried gait, meticulous gestures, always wearing the same grey janitor's uniform. No one really knew who he was. Few noticed his presence. To the hurried executives and distracted employees, he was merely part of the scenery, as relevant as the sound of the coffee maker or the noise of the elevator. The Elmwood building, a army construction from the early 1900s, with its high ceilings and Art Deco details, was one of the last vestiges of traditional architecture that still resisted among the modern glass and steel skyscrapers. It housed small local businesses, law offices, and accountants who had been operating there for decades, creating an almost family-like community that resisted the gentrification slowly devouring the historic downtown. Ernest arrived every morning, at 5 before any employee. He prepared coffee in the old pot in the lobby, meticulously checked every corner, cleaned the worn marble stairs, and polished the brass handrails until they shone like new. His calloused hands knew every imperfection in the building, the cracks on the 3rd floor, the window that always stuck in Attorney Morrison's office, the intermittent leak in the women's bathroom that appeared every rainy season. "Good morning." Mr. Guzman, Ms. Reeves, the secretary from the law firm on the 4th floor, would occasionally greet him, one of the few people who took the time to acknowledge his existence. "Good morning, miss," he would respond with a slight nod, without stopping his work, as if any interruption were an intolerable distraction from his responsibilities. But everything changed on a suffocating Friday afternoon, when the May heat fell relentlessly on the city and even the asphalt seemed to melt. 3 young men, led by Jack Sanders, son of a real estate businessman with political connections, entered the building with an air of arrogance. They wore expensive clothes and dark glasses, completely out of place with the traditional atmosphere. Ernest observed them from the corner where he was meticulously polishing the buttons of the old elevator, immediately noticing the threat in their postures, in the way they looked at every corner as if assessing its value. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" he asked upon seeing them prowling around the lobby without a defined purpose. "Nothing that concerns you, old man," Jack replied with a mocking smile. "We're just checking out our future investment." Thus began the siege. First came discreet graffiti in the bathrooms, threatening messages in the hallways. Then subtle sabotage, cut cables, tampered locks, important documents mysteriously disappearing from offices. The objective was simple: devalue the property to facilitate its acquisition by Sanders Construction, Jack's father's company, interested in demolishing the building to construct a modern commercial complex. The tenants began to feel the pressure. Attorney Morrison found his office flooded one morning. Mrs. Walker, owner of the small cafeteria on the 1st floor, suffered a power outage that ruined all her inventory. Little by little, fear settled in the Elmwood building. Ernest became the only real obstacle against these attacks. He reinforced locks, installed improvised security systems, and seemed to always be present when the young men tried to enter after hours. Each morning, he meticulously repaired the damage caused the night before, with infinite patience that began to exasperate the saboteurs. "That old man is a problem," commented Marcus, one of Jack's accomplices, as they observed the building from a cafe across the street. "He's always there, fixing everything we damage." "My father needs that building," Jack replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "The commercial complex project already has investors, permits almost approved. We just need to convince these stubborn people to sell." "What if we talk directly to the old man?" suggested Derek, the 3rd member of the group. "Maybe with a small compensation, he'll look the other way." They decided to confront him at the end of his workday. They waited until almost everyone had left the building, when the sun was beginning to set and the downtown streets emptied of office workers to fill with nightlife. Ernest was mopping the lobby floor with methodical and precise movements when the shadows of the three young men projected onto the freshly polished marble. "We need to talk, sir," Jack said, breaking the silence. The old man slowly raised his gaze, showing neither surprise nor fear. His dark, deep eyes studied the three young men as if evaluating a potential threat. "You're the ones who have been causing problems," he stated in a calm voice. It wasn't a question. "Look, this is very simple," Jack continued, approaching with false cordiality. "We know you care about this old building, but everything has a price, right?" Ernest remained silent, motionless, holding the mop as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the ground. "My father is willing to offer a good compensation," Jack added, pulling an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Enough for you to retire comfortably, far from here. You just have to stop interfering." The old man looked at the envelope without taking it, then fixed his eyes on the young men again. For an instant, something seemed to change in his gaze, a fleeting glimpse of something ancient and dangerous. "This building is the home and livelihood of many families," he finally responded. "It's not for sale." Jack's smile evaporated, giving way to a grimace of contempt. "You don't understand how this works, do you?" he said, putting the envelope away. "It's not a negotiation, it's a courtesy. The building will be ours, with or without your cooperation." What happened next would be recorded by the security cameras in the lobby. The pushing, the blows, the muffled shouts. No passerby intervened. Some pretended not to see. Others watched with guilt and cowardice from the safety of the sidewalk across the street. When the aggressors left laughing, convinced they had solved the problem, Ernest was left lying on the marble he had polished that very morning. He remained that way for long minutes, motionless, but his eyes were open, fixed on the ornate ceiling, while something inside him changed irrevocably. The next morning, for the first time in 8 years, Ernest Guzman did not show up for work. Ernest's absence was immediately noticed. The coffee wasn't prepared, dust accumulated in the corners, and a feeling of helplessness ran through the hallways of the Elmwood building. Ms. Reeves was the first to worry, trying unsuccessfully to contact the elderly janitor. "Does anyone know where Mr. Guzman lives?" she asked in the small cafeteria on the first floor, where several tenants gathered each morning. "He hasn't come today and isn't answering the janitor's office phone." They looked at each other, discovering with shame that no one really knew. The man who had taken care of the building for 8 years. No one knew his address, if he had family, what his hobbies were outside of work. Ernest was to them as functional and invisible as the pipes he maintained or the light bulbs he changed. That same night, as the historic downtown sank into darkness, something strange happened. The main gate of the building was unlocked in the morning, although Attorney Morrison swore he had double-locked it. The security cameras were turned toward the wall, showing only images of peeling plaster. Jack Sanders woke up in his luxurious apartment in Beacon Hill with an inexplicable pain in his shoulder. He didn't remember getting injured, but he could barely lift his arm. It was as if someone had applied precise leverage to his joint while he slept. Marcus, for his part, found his latest model car with sabotaged brakes. Not lethally, but alarming. Enough to make him lose control around a curve and end up with the vehicle crashed into a newsstand, fortunately without injuries. Derek, the third member of the group, received a call from the bank. His account had been blocked due to suspicious activities he didn't remember making, transfers to charitable organizations, donations to foundations supporting the elderly, and most strangely, the purchase of a bus ticket to Seattle in his name. The three incidents, apparently unconnected, presented a pattern that only they were beginning to perceive. Someone was hitting back, in a calculated and precise manner. "This is no coincidence," Jack said that afternoon, gathering his friends at a discreet restaurant. His arm rested in an improvised sling. "Someone is attacking us." "You think it was the old man?" Derek asked nervously, constantly checking his phone to verify the status of his accounts. "It's impossible. We left him in bad shape." "I don't know who else it could be," Jack replied. "Everything started after our encounter with him." "Maybe he has family," Marcus suggested, still pale from the scare of the accident. someone who wants revenge. Meanwhile, at the Elmwood building, the security guards hired by management began to report strange movements during the early morning. Sounds in the ventilation ducts, doors that opened and closed by themselves, fleeting shadows caught from the corner of their eyes. "This place is cursed," one of them commented, resigning after only 2 nights of work. "There's something here that doesn't want us here." Mrs. Walker, the cafeteria owner, found one morning that all her appliances were working perfectly, despite having been damaged the day before. In Attorney Morrison's office, documents that had mysteriously disappeared reappeared, meticulously arranged on his desk. "It's as if Mr. Guzman were still here," Ms. Reeves commented, taking care of the building in his own way. But the reality was much more complex. A few blocks from the building, in a small and austere apartment, in the North End, Ernest Guzman observed multiple screens connected to an improvised surveillance system. His hands, which everyone believed trembled with age, worked with millimetric precision on electronic components and detailed plans of the building and its surroundings. The small room was transformed into an operations center. On the walls, maps of the city marked with escape routes, public transportation schedules, and photos of Jack, Marcus, and Derek with their daily routines meticulously noted. On a table, several identifications with different names, all with his face, but showing him at different stages of his life. The old man's face, now concentrated and stripped of the mask of servility he had maintained for years, revealed a completely different man. His eyes, once always lowered and submissive, now shone with sharp, calculating intelligence. A satellite phone rang, breaking his concentration. "Are you sure about what you're doing, Michael?" asked a female voice on the other end. "I thought we agreed your retirement would be definitive." "It was, Caroline," he responded, using a name that no one in the building had ever heard, "until they forced me to return." "I can send you support," the woman offered, "like in the old days." "No," he responded firmly. "This is personal. Besides, you know I've always worked better alone." Upon hanging up, Michael Ernest Guzman Reyes, full name that appeared on an old military credential kept in a locked drawer, contemplated an old photograph. In it, a much younger man, dressed in a uniform that wasn't a janitor's, posed with a group of serious-faced people with penetrating gazes. On the back, written in faded ink, the words, "Special Strategic Protection Unit, Colorado, 1994. Meanwhile, in the offices of Sanders Construction, Jack's father's real estate empire, Richard Sanders was receiving disconcerting news. "What? Do you mean they withdrew from the project?" he shouted into the phone. "The permits were practically approved." "I'm sorry, Mr. Sanders," replied the nervous voice of an official. "There have been irregularities in the documentation. Moreover, we've received information about possible damage to historical heritage. The Elmwood building has just been declared under special protection by the Historic Preservation Office." Richard Sanders hung up furiously and immediately called his son. "What the hell is going on, Jack? First the investors back out, now the permits are frozen. Weren't you supposed to have the situation under control with those tenants?" "Everything was under control, Dad," Jack replied, adjusting his sling, "except for an old janitor who's been causing us problems." "A janitor?" The incredulity in Richard's voice was palpable. "Are you telling me a simple janitor is blocking a $50 million project?" "I don't think he's a simple janitor, Dad. There's something more going on there." Confirmation of his suspicions came that same afternoon when an elegant woman in her 60s appeared at the Elmwood building. She wore an impeccable suit and walked with the confidence of someone who knows the territory perfectly. She asked for Mr. Guzman and, upon receiving no response, left an envelope with Ms. Reeves. "Make sure all the tenants see this," she said, before leaving without further explanation. Ms. Reeves, consumed by curiosity, opened the envelope. It contained carefully preserved old newspaper clippings. In them, a man who bore an astonishing resemblance to Ernest, though much younger, appeared in different contexts, protecting businessmen. In conflict zones during the turbulent 1980s, assisting in investigations against corrupt organizations in the 90s, and always staying in the shadows, barely visible in the photographs, as if even then he preferred anonymity. The most recent of the clippings, dated 8 years earlier, mentioned the mysterious disappearance of the legendary operative Michael Guzman after a conflict with a real estate cartel that used intimidation tactics to appropriate historic properties in the downtown area. "He wasn't a simple janitor," Ms. Reeves murmured as the tenants gathered around her, examining the clippings with amazement. "He was something much more important." The news spread like wildfire among the tenants of the Elmwood building. Ernest, the humble janitor who for 8 years had gone unnoticed, was actually Michael Guzman, a former elite agent specialized in protection and counterintelligence. The newspaper clippings revealed fragments of an extraordinary life dedicated to undercover missions, witness protection, and dismantling corrupt organizations. "I always knew. There was something special about him," Mrs. Walker commented, although everyone knew that until 3 days ago she had barely greeted him. For Jack, Marcus, and Derek, the revelation was devastating. They hadn't beaten a defenseless old man. They had provoked a man trained in the art of invisible warfare, a specialist in turning the enemy's weaknesses into weapons against themselves. "We need to get out of the city," suggested Derek, the most nervous of the three. "This guy is playing with us like we're beginners." "I'm not going to run away like a coward," Jack replied, although the pain in his shoulder constantly reminded him they were facing someone far above their capabilities. "My father has invested too much in this project. We can't abandon it now." "Your father can afford to lose this investment," Marcus replied. "What we can't afford is to lose something more valuable." While they were arguing in Jack's apartment, none of them noticed the small device attached under the coffee table, capturing every word, every plan, every confession. In his operations center, Michael listened to the conversation with an impassive expression. Beside him, Caroline Rogers, the woman who had left the clippings at the building, watched the screens with concern. "You've given them too much information," she commented. "Now they know what they're up against." "That's precisely what I wanted," Michael replied without taking his eyes off the monitors. "The fear of the unknown is more powerful than any concrete threat." Caroline studied the face of her former partner, looking for traces of the daring young man with whom she had shared impossible missions 3 decades earlier. She found it in the determination of his gaze, in the precision of his movements, in the meticulous planning that characterized each of his actions. "Why that building, Michael?" she finally asked. "Of all the places you could have hidden, why did you choose to become a janitor there?" Michael was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal even to an old ally. "The Elmwood building isn't just a property," he finally replied. "It's the last piece of a puzzle we started putting together 20 years ago." He approached an old filing cabinet and extracted a bundle of documents, plans, photographs, classified reports. He spread them on the table, revealing a complex network of connections. "Remember Operation Coyote?" he asked, pointing to a photograph where both appeared much younger, along with other agents. "How could I forget?" Caroline replied, her face darkening with the memory. "We were on the verge of dismantling the entire money laundering network through real estate, until our own superiors ordered us to stop the investigation." "Exactly. We never knew who was really behind that order, who had so much power to silence an entire federal operation." Michael pointed to another, more recent document. "Sanders Construction is just the tip of the iceberg. Richard Sanders works for much larger interests. The real power is in the shadows, using legitimate corporations as a facade." "And the building?" "It contains the definitive proof. When they designed the complex in the 1920s, the architect included a hidden safe in the structure itself. There, he kept compromising documents about the true financiers as life insurance. When he mysteriously disappeared in 1925, the existence of that chamber became legend." "Did you find the chamber?" Caroline asked, fascinated by the revelation. "After 6 years of searching, yes. And what I found confirms our suspicions from 2 decades ago. The same names, the same families, controlling urban development in Boston from the shadows, eliminating anyone who stands in their way." Meanwhile, Richard Sanders was facing an unprecedented crisis. His investors were withdrawing one by one. His political contacts weren't answering his calls, and his company's shares were plummeting after the leak of several compromising emails detailing bribes and threats to public officials. "Someone is systematically sabotaging our entire operation," he shouted to his board of directors, gathered for an emergency meeting. "How is it possible that no one knows who's behind this?" A message appeared on his personal phone. Upon opening it, he found a single sentence. "Ask your son about Michael Guzman." At the Elmwood building, the atmosphere had completely changed. The tenants, previously fearful and resigned to the imminent sale of the property, were now organizing. Ms. Reeves coordinated a defense committee. Attorney Morrison offered pro bono legal advice, and Mrs. Walker turned her cafeteria into a meeting center where every new discovery about their mysterious ex-janitor and the shady business of Sanders Construction was shared. "It's as if Mr. Guzman had infected us with his spirit of resistance," one of the tenants commented during one of these meetings. What none of them knew was that Michael observed each of these meetings through the cameras he had discreetly installed over the years, preparing for the moment when the building would face its greatest threat. That night, Jack received a call from his father. "Who the hell is Michael Guzman?" Richard demanded to know, his voice tense with fury and fear. "The building's janitor," Jack replied, confused by the question. "I told you about him." "You didn't tell me he was a former federal agent specialized in undercover operations," Richard replied. "You didn't tell me you had beaten a man who has probably neutralized much more dangerous people than you without even wrinkling his suit." The silence on the other end of the line confirmed what Richard feared. "Do you have any idea what you've provoked?" he continued. "This man is systematically dismantling everything we've built. He's blocked the permits, scared off the investors, and now he's leaking confidential information to the authorities." "What do you want me to do?" Jack asked, feeling control of the situation slipping through his fingers. "Fix it," was his father's curt response. "Use any resource, any contact, but resolve this before it's too late." That same night, Richard Sanders made a call he had sworn never to make. He contacted a number he had kept for years for extreme emergencies, a resource only, turned to by those with enough money and desperation. "I need a problem solved," he said without identifying himself, knowing that on the other end they perfectly recognized his voice. "Michael Guzman, former agent, dangerous. I want him to disappear definitively." "It will cost triple the usual rate," replied a neutral voice. "This man has a reputation." "Whatever is necessary," Richard agreed. "Just make sure there's no trace left." What Richard Sanders ignored was that call, like all he had made in recent weeks, was being intercepted and recorded, adding another piece to the file that Michael Guzman was meticulously building. In D, his operations center, Michael listened to the conversation with an impassive expression. "He just made his last mistake," he commented to Caroline, who was preparing advanced communications equipment. "Now we have the direct connection we needed to link Sanders to the group we tried to dismantle 20 years ago." "And the professionals he's hired?" Caroline asked, concerned. "They're the best at what they do." An almost imperceptible smile formed on Michael's face. "They were," he corrected, "until they faced someone who has been preparing specifically for this moment for 8 years. The following dawn, a controlled fire affected the upper floor of the Elmwood building. There were no injuries, no alarm was activated. When the firefighters arrived, they found that the fire had extinguished itself as mysteriously as it had started. Among the debris, a message carved into a piece of metal. "You don't know what you've done yet." Michael Guzman had launched his final warning. The true battle was about to begin. The news of the fire at the Elmwood building appeared in all local newspapers. What should have been a simple incident became a media phenomenon when someone leaked to the press the story of the mysterious janitor who turned out to be a former elite agent. Headlines speculated about government conspiracies, undercover operations, and the silent war for control of the valuable real estate heritage of the historic downtown. Who is Michael Guzman, really? The Boston Globe asked on its front page, alongside a blurry photograph of the supposed janitor, taken years ago. For Richard Sanders, the publicity was a catastrophe. His plans depended on anonymity, discretion, agreements signed in windowless rooms. Now every move by Sanders Construction was scrutinized by journalists hungry for scandals and officials fearful of being involved in a corruption plot. "I want results," he demanded through a secure line, contacting the specialized team he had hired. "What am I paying you for if you can't find a simple old man?" "Mr. Sanders," replied the measured voice of the team leader, a former military man known only as Colonel Sullivan. "This simple old man has deactivated all our tracking systems, intercepted our communications, and disabled 2 of our best operatives without us even seeing him. We need to change our strategy." "I'm not interested in your excuses," Richard snapped. "I want this to end now." Colonel Sullivan, a man accustomed to facing impossible situations in theaters of operations around the world, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: unease. He had thoroughly investigated Michael Guzman, and what he discovered made him question whether they had underestimated this job. "We will proceed with Operation Scorpion," he finally informed. "We will enter the building tonight. It will be quick and definitive." Meanwhile, in Jack's apartment, the 3 young men contemplated their increasingly limited options. "We have to turn ourselves in," suggested Derek, whose bank account remained blocked and whose parents had begun receiving anonymous calls detailing each of his illicit activities. "This guy is going to ruin our lives if we don't." "Turn ourselves in? Are you crazy?" Jack replied, pacing nervously around the room. "My father has invested millions in this. Besides, we hired professionals. The game is over for the old man." Marcus, who had remained unusually quiet, was looking out the window. His car had been the only vehicle damaged in a strange incident with the sprinkler system in the underground parking garage the night before. "Do you know who Michael Guzman was before becoming a janitor?" he finally asked, without taking his eyes off the street. "He was known as the Ghost, specialist in strategic disappearances, protection of critical witnesses, and neutralization of threats without leaving a trace. A man capable of becoming invisible in any environment." "How do you know all that?" Jack asked, surprised by the information. "Because my uncle worked with him," Marcus replied, finally turning to face his friends. "In the 90s, during the special operations in Colorado, my uncle says he was the best, and that if he has decided to reveal himself after so long in the shadows, it's because he has an infallible plan." The silence that followed these words was interrupted by the sound of Jack's cell phone. It was his father. "The team will enter tonight," Richard informed without preamble. "I want you and your friends to stay completely away from the building." "Understood. This is going to get complicated." In the improvised operations center, Michael and Caroline were finalizing their preparations. The apartment was now empty except for the essential equipment. Everything else had been moved to secure locations. "I intercepted the order," Caroline informed, reviewing an encrypted communication. "They're sending a complete team, 5 operatives, state-of-the-art weaponry, silent incursion protocols. They'll enter at midnight." Michael nodded, his face as imperturbable as always. On the table, he had spread out the complete blueprint of the Elmwood building, with meticulous annotations made during 8 years of patient observation. "Are you sure you want to face them alone?" Caroline asked, the concern evident in her voice. "We can call some of the old contacts. They owe you favors." "I don't want to involve anyone else," Michael replied. "This is my battle. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I won't be alone." At the Elmwood building, unaware of the storm that was approaching, the tenants were celebrating a small victory. The Historic Preservation Office had issued an official statement recognizing the architectural and historical value of the property, which would make any demolition attempt extremely difficult. "It's incredible how everything changed in a matter of days, Ms." Reeves commented, serving coffee in mismatched cups in Mrs. Walker's cafeteria. "From being about to lose our businesses to becoming part of the protected historical heritage. All thanks to Mr. Guzman," added Attorney Morrison. "Sorry, Michael. I still find it hard to get used to his real name." None of them suspected that in a few hours, their beloved building would become the stage for a silent confrontation between professionals trained to move among the shadows. At 11:30 p.m., Colonel Sullivan and his team positioned themselves strategically around the Elmwood building. They wore black, with state-of-the-art tactical equipment, night vision subauricular communicators, non-lethal weapons designed to incapacitate without leaving evidence. Primary target, Michael Guzman, alias The Ghost, Sullivan reminded his team. Clean extraction, no witnesses, no traces. We have information that he might be using the building's basement as an operations center. What Sullivan ignored was that every word of that communication was being heard by Michael, who had intercepted their encrypted frequency days ago. He also didn't know that the building that seemed so vulnerable had been converted over 8 patient years into a sophisticated trap designed specifically to neutralize threats like the one now approaching. At 12:01 a.m., Sullivan's team initiated the incursion. 2 operatives entered through the roof, 2 more discreetly forced an entrance through the underground parking garage, and Sullivan headed toward the main entrance, confident in the numerical and technological superiority of his team. What happened in the following 2 hours would be etched in the memory of each of them as the most disconcerting operation of their careers. First, the communication equipment began to fail, emitting static noises that soon gave way to a soft, measured voice. "Welcome to the Elmwood building. I suggest you reconsider your mission." Then darkness became absolute when the night vision devices shut off simultaneously. Strobe lights emerged from unsuspected corners, disorienting the intruders. The hallways, which according to the plans should lead to clear exits, became labyrinths where doors opened and closed automatically, separating the team. Sprinkler systems strategically activated released a non-toxic but disorienting mist with a slight aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the same that Ernest prepared each morning. One by one, the operatives were neutralized, not through direct violence, but through ingenious traps that temporarily immobilized them. One was locked in an elevator that slowly descended to the basement, another was lured into a room where the floor gave way beneath his feet, depositing him in a confined but safe space. Colonel Sullivan, veteran of dozens of clandestine operations, finally found himself alone in the building's lobby. His team gone, his communications useless, his confidence shattered. It was then that the lights came on, revealing a man sitting calmly at the reception. It wasn't the stooped old man he expected to find. Michael Guzman, erect and alert despite his age, observed him with a mixture of calm and determination that defied the years. "Colonel Sullivan," Michael greeted, as if it were a scheduled meeting. "I've deactivated your weapons. Your men are safe, though temporarily indisposed. Now we have 10 minutes before the authorities respond to an alert I just activated. I suggest we make use of them." Sullivan, recognizing when he was at a tactical disadvantage, nodded slowly. "I'm listening," he replied, maintaining professional composure. "Richard Sanders works for the same group we tried to dismantle 20 years ago," Michael explained, getting straight to the point. "I have documentary evidence, financial transactions, recordings, enough to send many powerful people to prison for decades." He extracted a small storage device and slid it across the counter. "But that's not my goal," he continued. "All I want is for this building and its occupants to be left in peace, permanently." "Why are you telling me this?" Sullivan asked, disconcerted by the turn of events. "Because you're not like them," Michael replied with certainty. "I checked your record, Colonel. 30 years of impeccable service. You've never crossed certain lines, even when ordered to do so. You're a professional, not a mercenary." Sullivan took the storage device, weighing his options. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That you show Richard Sanders a small fraction of what I have," Michael replied. "Enough to convince him that withdrawing is his only viable option. In exchange, this evidence will remain safely stored, unless they threaten this place or its occupants again." A calculated silence extended between both men, 2 professionals who recognized each other as equals. "Or I can send everything to the authorities right now," Michael added, discreetly pointing to several sealed envelopes on a nearby table, "and let the judicial system do its job, as imperfect as it is." Sirens began to be heard in the distance. Time was running out. 3 days after the strange nocturnal incident at the Elmwood building, an unusual calm had settled over the place. The tenants noticed that the security cameras had been replaced with more discreet and efficient models. The locks, electrical. Systems and plumbing seemed to function with a precision never before seen. It was as if the building had been reborn, silently renovated by expert hands. In the offices of Sanders Construction, Richard contemplated the city from his window on the 30th floor of a modern corporate tower. His face, usually composed and confident, now showed the traces of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "We'll cancel all projects in the historic district," he announced to his board of directors, ignoring the expressions of surprise. "We'll focus on developments in Hartford and Providence. The Boston real estate market is too complicated at the moment." No one questioned his decision. The tone of his voice admitted no debate, and rumors about recent events had reached even the highest levels of the company. There was talk of compromising documents, veiled threats, an adversary impossible to defeat by conventional means. Jack observed his father from a corner of the boardroom, noticing for the first time the gray hair that had appeared at his temples, the wrinkles that deepened around his eyes. In just 1 week, Richard Sanders seemed to have aged years. After the meeting, father and son remained alone. "What did he show you?" Jack asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "What did that man tell you to make you abandon a project of this magnitude?" Richard poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to his son. "It wasn't what he showed me," he finally replied. "It was what he made me understand." He took a long drink before continuing. "There are battles that can't be won, Jack. Not because the enemy is stronger, but because he fights for something that goes beyond business or money. Michael Guzman isn't defending a building. He's defending a principle. And our investors, what will we tell them?" Richard gave a bitter smile. "Curiously, they've all withdrawn their interest in the project. Apparently, they received certain information that made them reconsider their participation." At the Elmwood building, life was beginning to normalize. Mrs. Walker had renovated her cafeteria, Attorney Morrison had hired 2 interns to expand his office, and Ms. Reeves was organizing a cultural event to celebrate the building's designation as protected heritage. "Has anyone seen Mr. Guzman?" some tenant would occasionally ask, using the name by which they had all known him for 8 years. No one had seen him since the night of the incident. His small room on the ground floor was empty. His few belongings had disappeared, as if he had never existed. Only his old grey uniform remained, carefully folded on the bed. Marcus, Derek and Jack met for the last time at the cafe across from the Elmwood building. Their friendship, forged in the complicity of ambitious plans, was fading in the face of the reality of their actions and their consequences. "I'm going to California," Derek announced, avoiding looking directly at his friends. "My uncle has contacts there. I can start over." "I'm going back to university," said Marcus. "Civil engineering. I want to build, not destroy." Jack remained silent, observing the building that had triggered the whole story. Under the golden light of sunset, the Art Deco details shone with renewed elegance, as if the property itself was celebrating its survival. "What will you do?" Derek finally asked. "Learn," Jack simply replied. "My father says there are lessons that are only understood after having lost." The 3 young men said goodbye with the discomfort of those who have shared a failure, but also with the strange sensation of having escaped something much worse. None mentioned that, for days, they had had the constant impression of being watched, followed by an invisible but vigilant presence. Miles away in a small house in Cambridge, Caroline Rogers prepared tea for her old friend and partner. "Are you sure you want to disappear again?" she asked, watching Michael as he reviewed documents on his tablet. "You could stay. The tenants consider you a hero." "I've never been interested in being a hero," he replied with a slight smile, "and my work there is finished." "And the documents from the secret chamber, the evidence against the network?" Michael closed the tablet and looked out the window, toward the garden where the bougainvilleas were blooming intensely. "They're safe, and they'll serve as insurance so those people never threaten the building or its occupants again." Caroline studied her friend's face, looking for signs of regret or doubt. "Was it worth it?" she finally asked. 8 years as a janitor, hidden in plain sight just to protect a building and unmask a network we could have confronted in other ways. "So it wasn't just a building," Michael replied, his gaze lost in memories he didn't share. It was proof that some principles resist the passage of time, that some battles, however small they may seem, must be fought to the end. A week later, the tenants of the Elmwood building received an unexpected surprise. The building's management announced the creation of an anonymous foundation that would fund the complete restoration of the building and establish a fund to help small local businesses remain in the historic downtown, resisting the pressure of gentrification. Who could be behind this, everyone wondered, though in their hearts they already knew the answer. The story took one final turn when Ms. Reeves, while organizing old files, found a yellowed envelope addressed to her. Inside was a single photograph, a young Michael Guzman, in what appeared to be a mission in some remote location, smiling alongside a woman who looked astonishingly like Ms. Reeves's own mother. On the back, a note written in the meticulous handwriting she instantly recognized. "Some connections transcend generations. Your mother was my first contact in the building 30 years ago. The circle closes with you." Ms. Reeves felt that the pieces of a personal puzzle finally fit together. The stories her mother told about a mysterious protector, the letters she jealously guarded, the interest she had always shown in the Elmwood building despite never having worked there. Meanwhile, on a road winding toward the coast of Maine, Michael Guzman drove with the window down, enjoying the sea breeze. Beside him, a new identity document and a different life awaited him. It wasn't the first time he had reinvented himself, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Traffic temporarily stopped due to roadwork. Next to his car, a family in a minivan was waiting patiently. A small child observed him curiously from his seat. Michael returned the gaze and, for the first time in a long time, smiled broadly and waved. The child, surprised, enthusiastically returned the greeting. That night, in Chiu, a modest hotel overlooking the Atlantic, Michael contemplated the horizon as the sun sank into the sea. His satellite phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Are you enjoying your retirement?" asked Caroline's familiar voice. "More or less," he replied. "Any news?" "Richard Sanders has sold his construction company. He's retiring to Canada, according to our sources. The boys, following the paths they chose, we're watching them as agreed. And the building? Thriving like never before. Ms. Reeves found your message, by the way. She's investigating her mother's archives." Michael smiled at the mention of the young secretary. "She has the same spirit as Teresa," he commented nostalgically. "Observant, brave, incorruptible. Like her father," Caroline added significantly, "though she doesn't know it yet." A silence laden with unrevealed secrets floated between them. "Will you ever come back?" Caroline finally asked. Michael watched the first stars appear in the night sky. "Only if they need me again," he replied. "Meanwhile, there are other buildings, other stories, other principles to defend." He hung up the phone and put the storage unit containing copies of all the documents found in the secret chamber of the Elmwood building in his suitcase. His most powerful weapon wasn't the skills learned during decades of service, but the information he had patiently accumulated. In the following days, the Elmwood building received a new janitor, a middle-aged man, quiet and meticulous, who prepared coffee every morning and polished the handrails until they shone. No one knew much about him, except that he had been recommended by an anonymous source and that he knew the building as if he had worked there all his life. Miss Reeves occasionally observed him from her office, noting his silent efficiency so similar to Ernest's. Sometimes, when their gazes crossed, she thought she saw a wink of complicity, as if they both shared a secret. Perhaps they did. In the world built by Michael Guzman, coincidences didn't exist. Only invisible connections between people who defended the same principles, who fought the same battles, generation after generation. And somewhere on the coast of Maine, a man who had dedicated his life to operating in the shadows finally rested in the sun, knowing that his legacy continued, silent but unstoppable, like the echoes of footsteps in the hallways of a building that refused to disappear. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Ernest and the Elmwood building has captivated you. To continue this journey through equally passionate tales, we've prepared a special list with stories that explore human complexity and redemption. Find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Each day we bring new narratives that invite us to reflect on justice, honor, and unbreakable principles. Who might Michael Guzman really have been? What secrets did the Elmwood building hold? Share your theories in the comments. We'll see you tomorrow with a new story that will leave you breathless.